Every working morning for decades, in the city of Baltimore, a man named Earl Crawley walked to an open-air parking lot near the harbor. He wore a uniform. He carried a thermos. He spent his day in the weather, parking cars, collecting tickets, watching the lot, the way he had spent nearly every working day of his adult life. He earned in a good year about $20,000. Earl Crawley did not earn the salary of a professional. He did not have a college degree. As a young man, he could barely read. He had left school early, and the printed page was, for years, almost closed to him. He worked his whole life, one of the most modest-paying jobs in the American economy. A parking lot attendant. And yet, by the time people began to take notice of him, Earl Crawley owned a portfolio of stocks, real shares in real American companies worth more than $500,000. He had built it himself, $10 at a time, $20 at a time, out of a parking attendant's wages. And he did something the other people in this channel's stories never did. He did not keep it secret. Earl Crawley spent decades teaching the people around him, dock workers, janitors, fellow attendants, his neighbors, and his church, exactly how he was doing it. He wanted them to do it too. This is the story of how he did it, and what it can teach the rest of us. Earl Crawley grew up in modest, difficult circumstances in the Baltimore area in the middle of the 20th century. Money was tight. Opportunity was narrow. For a black working-class child in that time and place, the doors that led to easy wealth were, for the most part, firmly shut. He did not get much formal schooling. He left education early to work, as many children in his circumstances did, and the cost of that was real and lasting. As a young man, Earl Crawley struggled to read. The newspaper, the contract, the printed instruction, these were obstacles, not tools. It is worth holding that fact clearly in mind as this story unfolds, because the man who would later build a stock portfolio and teach others to do the same began adult life nearly unable to read the financial page. Earl found work where a man in his position could find it, in physical labor, in service jobs, in the open air. Eventually, he came to the job that would define his working life. He became a parking lot attendant in downtown Baltimore, near the inner harbor. He managed a lot. He parked the cars, collected the fees, kept the booth, watched over the vehicles in his care. He did it well, and he did it with pride. And he did it for decade after decade. His income from that job was small. By the accounts that later emerged, Earl Crawley's pay rarely rose much above $20,000 a year. That is not a salary anyone associates with building wealth. It is a salary associated with getting by, with rent, with groceries, with making the month reach its end. For most people who earn it, it leaves nothing behind. No portfolio, no reservoir, no fortune of any size at all. Earl Crawley was a man of deep faith and steady character. He was active in his church. He was devoted to his family. He was known by everyone who dealt with him as honest, cheerful, and hardworking. He was, in the eyes of the world, an ordinary, low-wage working man. And he was about to prove that the word ordinary hides far more than it reveals. At some point in his working life, Earl Crawley made a decision. It was not a dramatic decision. There was no windfall, no inheritance, no sudden change in his fortunes. It was simply a decision about what to do with the small, painful margin of money that a disciplined person can squeeze out of even a modest wage. Earl decided that he would become an owner. Not a spender, an owner. He had come to understand, and we will look closely at how, that there is a fundamental difference between the people who merely earn money and the people who own pieces of the companies that the money flows through. The earners trade their hours for wages, and the wages are spent. The owners hold a share of the enterprise itself, and the enterprise, if it is a good one, pays them and grows for them, whether they are working or sleeping. How does a man who can barely read decide to buy stock? The answer is one of the quiet glories of Earl Crawley's story. He did not let the printed page defeat him. Earl Crawley taught himself. He worked, with great patience and effort, to improve his reading, so that the financial page, the company report, the printed listing would open to him. He asked questions of people who knew more than he did. He listened. He learned. He turned a closed door into an open one by sheer, sustained will. And then he began to buy. He could not buy much at a time. His wage did not allow it. So he bought small. He bought shares $10 at a time, $20 at a time. Whatever the margin between his pay and his expenses would allow, that month he converted into ownership. He used dividend reinvestment plans and direct stock purchase plans, arrangements that let an ordinary person buy small amounts of a company's stock regularly without a large account or a costly broker. Earl Crawley did not need to be rich to begin. He needed only to begin. Stop and absorb how radical that simple idea is. Earl Crawley believed, correctly, that the stock market, the great wealth-building engine that most working people assume is reserved for the rich, was open to him. A parking attendant earning $20,000 a year could own a piece of the same great American companies as a banker on the top floor of the tower across the street. The companies did not check his salary. They did not check his job title or his schooling or how easily he could read. They simply sold him shares, $10 at a time, and paid him dividends like any other owner. The first principle of Earl Crawley's fortune was the one he worked hardest to teach others. Stop being only a worker. Become also an owner. Earl Crawley spent his days in a parking lot owned by someone else, in a city of buildings owned by someone else, working for a wage paid by someone else. He understood his position in that arrangement with perfect clarity. He was, in the language of finance, on the labor side of the economy. He sold his hours, and his hours, once sold, were gone. There is a hard ceiling on that arrangement, and Earl Crawley saw the ceiling plainly. No matter how hard he worked, the wage was the wage. A man cannot park enough cars to become wealthy. But Earl Crawley also saw the other side of the economy, the ownership side. And he saw that, unlike the parking lot, it had no ceiling at all. When you own shares of a company, you own a piece of its profits, its growth, its dividends, its future. You are no longer only renting out your hours. You have a second source of income, one that does not tire, does not age, and does not stop when you put down your tools at the end of a shift. Earl could not raise his wage much, but he could, dollar by dollar, build himself a second income that he owned outright. And a second income, however small at first, is a different kind of thing entirely from a wage. And the companies Earl Crawley chose to own reveal his good sense. He did not chase speculation or the hot tip. He bought into solid, well-known American businesses, the kind that sold things people use every day, that paid dividends, that had survived a long time and would likely survive longer. He bought banks. He bought consumer companies. He bought utilities and household names. He bought the boring, dependable backbone of the American economy. The same category of company that Ronald Read bought in Vermont and Ann Scheiber bought in Manhattan. Earl Crawley had never met those people. He arrived at the same wisdom on his own. He held what he bought. Earl Crawley was not a trader. He did not buy a stock in order to sell it. He bought a stock in order to own it, to keep it, to receive its dividends, to watch it grow over years and decades. When the market fell, as markets always eventually do, Earl did not panic and sell. He understood that he owned pieces of real businesses, and that a frightening day on the market did not stop people from using a bank or buying their groceries. So he held, and when he could, he used the low prices to buy a little more. There is a quiet dignity in this that is easy to miss. Earl Crawley, parking other people's cars in a lot he did not own, had quietly made himself a part owner of the American economy. He had a stake. He had standing. He was no longer only a man who worked in the city. He was, in a real and legal sense, a man who owned a small piece of it. The second principle is the one that turned Earl Crawley's modest ownership into a $500,000 portfolio. It was consistency. The small amount invested without fail again and again for decades. Earl Crawley could only invest a little at a time. $10, $20, perhaps more in a good month, less in a hard one. On its own, any single one of those purchases was almost meaningless. $10 of stock does not change a life. But Earl Crawley did not make the purchase once. He made it every month. Through good years and lean ones. Through raises that barely came and bills that always did. For decade after decade after decade. This approach has a name in the world of investing. It is sometimes called dollar cost averaging, the practice of investing a fixed, modest amount on a regular schedule, no matter what the market is doing. And it has a hidden gift inside it, one that is perfectly suited to a working person with a small budget. When the market is high, your fixed amount buys fewer shares. When the market is low, when prices have fallen and most people are afraid, your same fixed amount buys more shares. The discipline of investing the same amount every month quietly forces you to buy more when stocks are cheap and less when they are dear, which is exactly what a wise investor is supposed to do, and exactly what frightened investors almost never manage. And then there was the engine beneath the engine. Reinvested dividends. Every company Earl Crawley owned paid him dividends, small, regular cash payments for being an owner. Earl did not take that cash and spend it. He reinvested it automatically into still more shares. So his portfolio grew from two directions at once, from the fresh $10 and $20 he added from his wages each month, and from the dividends his existing shares paid, quietly buying still more shares on their own. More shares paid more dividends. More dividends bought more shares. On a 30-year timescale, that is the whole machine. Consider the timeline of it, because the timeline is where the lesson lives. In Earl Crawley's first years of investing, the results were almost invisible. A few $100s, then a few thousand. Nothing that looked like wealth, nothing that would have impressed anyone. Most people, seeing such small numbers after years of effort, quietly give up. They decide it is not working, and they stop. Earl Crawley did not stop. He kept adding his small amounts, kept reinvesting his dividends, kept holding through every storm, and somewhere in the later decades, the curve that had crawled along the bottom of the chart for years began at last to climb, and then to climb steeply. By the time the world began to notice Earl Crawley, the small amounts had compounded into a portfolio worth more than $500,000, built entirely from a parking attendant's wage, built $10 at a time, built by a man who, decades earlier, had needed to teach himself to read before he could even begin. There was no magic in it. There was only consistency, patience, and the refusal to ever stop feeding the machine. Here is where Earl Crawley's story turns away from every other story in this channel, and becomes, in one specific way, the best of them. Earl Crawley did not keep his method a secret. He gave it away. Ronald Reed told no one. Ann Scheiber told no one. Grace Groner told no one. Kurt Degemann told almost no one. Their fortunes were discovered with astonishment only at the end. Earl Crawley did the opposite. For decades, while he was still building his own portfolio, he spent his time and his energy teaching the people around him exactly how to build theirs. Think about who those people were. Earl Crawley did not teach bankers or executives. He taught the people in his own world, fellow parking attendants, dock workers, janitors, laborers, the members of his church, his neighbors on his street. He taught working people who had been told in 100 quiet ways that the stock market was not for them, that investing was something other people did, that wealth was a country they did not have a passport to. Earl Crawley told them, plainly and patiently, that this was not true. He had the proof in his own folder, and he wanted them to have it too. He helped organize and lead an investment club. A group of ordinary working people who pooled their knowledge, and sometimes their small contributions, to learn the discipline of buying and holding stock. He walked them through it. How to buy small, how to use the plans that did not require a fortune to start, how to reinvest the dividends, how to hold through fear, how to keep going when the early numbers were small and discouraging. Earl Crawley became, for an entire community, the teacher that the financial world had never sent them. Why did he do this? Why share the very knowledge that, kept private, could have set him apart? Because Earl Crawley did not see wealth as a competition. He saw the gap, the painful, generational gap between the people who owned and the people who only worked. And he understood that closing that gap, for the people in his own community, was something within his power to help do. His faith taught him that what you know is meant to be shared. So he shared it. Earl Crawley's true fortune was never only the $500,000 in his folder. It was also every neighbor he set on the same path. We are honest in every episode of this channel about the cost of building wealth in silence. The isolation, the secrecy, the fortune that surfaces only at a funeral. Earl Crawley paid none of that cost. He built his $500,000 in full view, with open hands, surrounded by people he was lifting alongside himself. He proved that patient wealth building does not have to be lonely. It can be a thing you do together. It can be, in the deepest sense, a gift you give while you are still alive to give it. To understand how Earl Crawley sustained this discipline across decades, you have to understand the shape of the life around it. Earl Crawley was a man of routine, faith, and modest tastes. He did not spend extravagantly because extravagance held no appeal for him, and because every dollar spent loudly was a dollar that could not buy a quiet share of stock. He lived in a modest home. He kept a vegetable garden. He valued his family, his church, and his work. His pleasures were not expensive ones, and so the gap between his small wage and his smaller spending stayed open, month after month, year after year, which is the only reason there was ever anything left to invest at all. His faith was central, and it is worth pausing on, because it shaped how he held money. Earl Crawley did not worship his portfolio. He did not check it obsessively or define himself by its size, or let it become the meaning of his days. To Earl, the portfolio was a tool, a responsibility, a thing to be stewarded carefully and used wisely, but not a god. That spiritual steadiness gave him something most investors never have. It gave him peace through the market's storms. When prices crashed and others panicked, Earl Crawley's sense of his own worth was not on the line, because his worth had never been measured by the number. And so he could hold, calmly, faithfully, through everything. He kept careful records. Earl Crawley, the man who had once struggled to read, kept track of every company he owned, every share he held, every dividend he received. He knew what he owned and why he owned it. That knowledge was a form of armor. An investor who truly understands what they hold cannot easily be frightened out of it, because fear rushes in to fill the space where understanding is missing. Earl left no such space. His records, kept in his own hand, were the quiet infrastructure beneath decades of nerve. And in keeping with everything else about him, Earl Crawley did not do it entirely alone. He had his investment club, a community of fellow learners. He had the structure of the direct purchase plans and the brokerages that processed his small, steady buys. He had family and church and the people he taught, who were also the people who helped keep him accountable. We say this in every episode of this channel. The lone investor doing everything in total isolation is not the model. Earl Crawley made his own decisions, but he was surrounded by design with people who knew what he was doing and were doing it alongside him. If you wanted to summarize what made it possible for Earl Crawley to compound $500,000 on a parking attendant's wage, you could do worse than this list. A vegetable garden, a church pew, a record book in a careful hand, a refusal to stop buying, and a community he insisted on bringing along with him. In time, Earl Crawley's quiet story began to draw attention. A parking lot attendant who had built a stock portfolio of more than $500,000 and who taught his working-class neighbors to do the same is the kind of story that, once discovered, is not easily forgotten. But the importance of Earl Crawley was never really the $500,000 itself. By the standards of the very wealthy, $500,000 is a modest sum. The importance of Earl Crawley was what that sum proved. It proved that the wealth-building machine of the American economy was not, in fact, sealed off from the working poor. It proved that a man with a tiny wage, little schooling, and a hard start could become a genuine owner of capital if he understood the method and had the patience to run it. Think about how many people that proof was aimed at. There are millions of working people in this country who have been told, in ways both loud and quiet, that investing is not for them. That the stock market belongs to the educated, the affluent, the already wealthy. That their job is to work and to spend, and that ownership is a door with someone else's name on it. Earl Crawley's life is a standing refutation of that entire idea. He did not have advantages. He did not have an education. He did not have a large income. He had a method, and he had patience. And with nothing more than those two things, he walked through a door that millions of people wrongly believe is locked. And consider what Earl Crawley chose to do with his standing once he had it. He did not use his story to set himself above the people he came from. He used it as a teaching tool. Every time his story was told, it carried his method with it. Buy small, buy often, hold forever. Reinvest everything, never stop. Earl Crawley turned his own life into a lesson, freely available to anyone willing to learn it. He had no enormous fortune to leave behind in a will. What he left behind instead was something arguably more valuable. A proof and a method and a community of people he had personally set on the path. Earl Crawley's wealth, in the end, was counted in more than dollars. It was counted in the neighbors who started their own portfolios because of him, and the working people who learned, from a man exactly like themselves, that they too could own a piece of the economy. In the simple, world-changing idea, planted in mind after mind, that a small wage is not a sentence. That it is, with patience and method, enough now. What does Earl Crawley's story actually teach us? Lesson 1. Become an owner, not only a worker. Earl Crawley understood that a wage has a ceiling, and ownership does not. However you earn your living, you can also, in parallel, own a piece of the broader economy, and that ownership becomes a second income that never tires and never stops. You do not have to leave your job to do this. You simply have to stand, at the same time, on both sides of the economy. Earn with your hours, and own with your savings. Lesson 2. Small and consistent beats large and rare. Earl Crawley invested $10 and $20 at a time, every single month, for decades. He never had a windfall, and he did not need one. The power was never in the size of any one purchase. It was in the relentless, unbroken repetition of small ones. If you are waiting until you can invest a large amount, you are misunderstanding the engine. The engine runs on consistency, not on size. Begin with what you have, this month, and then simply never miss another month. Lesson 3. Reinvestment is the engine. Earl Crawley reinvested every dividend his shares paid him, automatically, into still more shares. He never spent that cash on himself during the building years. Most people who own dividend-paying stocks take the cash and spend it. Earl did not. That single repeated choice, reinvest, 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 is a large part of the structural difference between an ordinary outcome and a $500,000 portfolio built on a tiny wage. Lesson 4. Knowledge is armor. Earl Crawley, who had once struggled to read, taught himself enough to understand exactly what he owned and why. That knowledge was what allowed him to hold calmly through every crash. An investor who does not understand what they hold can be frightened out of it, because fear floods into the space where understanding is missing. You do not need a finance degree. You need to genuinely understand the simple things you own. And that understanding will keep your hands still on the days when other people's hands are shaking. Lesson 5. have a circle. Earl Crawley made his own decisions, but he surrounded himself with an investment club, with his church, with family and neighbors who knew what he was doing. A great deal of personal finance advice quietly implies you must do everything alone. You should not. A circle keeps you accountable, catches your mistakes, and steadies you when you waver. Earl's circle did not get rich off him. They built alongside him, which made every one of them, including Earl, more likely to succeed. Lesson 6, and this is Earl Crawley's own great addition to everything this channel teaches. Share what you learn. Earl Crawley did not hoard his method. He gave it away, for decades, to everyone in his community who would listen. And in doing so, he discovered something the silent millionaires never did. Wealth building does not have to be lonely. It does not have to be a secret carried alone and revealed only at a funeral. It can be a thing you do in the open, surrounded by people you are lifting as you climb. The knowledge in your hands, once you have it, costs you nothing to pass on, and it may be the most valuable thing you ever give. And one last reflection, the one Earl Crawley's whole life presses gently upon us. He began with almost every disadvantage: poverty, little schooling, a wage near the bottom of the economy, a printed page he could barely read. And none of it stopped him. Earl Crawley is the proof, standing in a parking attendant's uniform, that the method in this channel is not reserved for people with advantages. It is not reserved for the educated, or the affluent, or the lucky. It is open. It was open to Earl Crawley. And it is open to you. Before we close, a practical bridge from Earl's story to your situation. Because a case study is only useful if it changes something this week. 1. Begin investing this month with a small amount you genuinely will not miss. Earl Crawley began with $10 and $20 at a time, and the smallness of the amount was never the obstacle. Choose an amount so modest that it cannot frighten you or strain you, and start now. The size can grow later. What matters is that the habit begins today, because the years you give it are worth more than the dollars you start with. 2. Automate the small amount so consistency does not depend on willpower. Earl Crawley's strength was that he never missed a month. Your modern advantage is that you do not have to remember. Set up an automatic transfer that moves your fixed amount into a low-cost index fund the day after each payday, before the rest of your life can spend it. Automate the discipline, and the discipline becomes effortless. 3. Own broad and simple, the whole economy in one fund. Earl Crawley assembled his ownership company by company. You have an easier path. A single broad, low-cost total market index fund makes you a part owner of hundreds or thousands of American companies at once for almost no fee. You do not need to pick the right stock. You need to own the whole shelf and let the strength of the broad economy do for you what Earl's careful picks did for him. 4. Switch on automatic dividend reinvestment and never switch it off. This was a core engine of Earl Crawley's growth, and in a modern brokerage account, it is a single setting. Find the option labeled Automatic Dividend Reinvestment and turn it on for every long-term position. Set once, forgotten forever. It is one of the most consequential and least dramatic choices of your entire investing life. 5. Find your circle, and then teach someone. This is the practice that made Earl Crawley more than an investor. First, find or form a small group of honest people building toward the same goal. It will keep you accountable and steady you through fear. And then, once you understand the method, do what Earl did. Teach it. Pass it to a friend, a child, a neighbor, a coworker who believes the door is closed to them. The knowledge costs you nothing to give away, and in giving it, you make your own resolve stronger. Because it is far harder to abandon a path you have asked someone else to walk beside you. If you do those 5 things, even imperfectly, even slowly, you are running, on your own scale, the same program Earl Crawley ran for decades. You may not arrive at a precise figure, and the number matters less than you think. But you will end up far further along than the great majority of people who out-earned you and outspent you every single year. And if you teach it forward, you will have lifted others as you climbed. That is the quiet promise of compound interest, proven in a Baltimore parking lot by a man who started with almost nothing and refused to believe the door was locked. Earl Crawley spent his working life in an open-air parking lot near the Baltimore harbor. In a uniform, earning a wage that the world assumed would leave nothing behind. To everyone who handed him a ticket and a few dollars, he was a parking attendant, a low-wage working man, nothing more. That was the visible life. It was only a fraction of the truth. Behind that uniform, a man who had once struggled even to read had taught himself the oldest secret of wealth, that the worker can also be an owner, and had built $10 at a time a stock portfolio worth more than $500,000. And then, unlike almost anyone else who has ever done such a thing, he spent his life giving the method away. He did not hide his fortune until a funeral. He turned it, while he lived, into a lesson for everyone who would listen. We talk a great deal in modern personal finance about getting rich quickly, about leverage, side income, the perfect entry, the well-timed exit. All of those things have their place, but the quiet truth, the one the financial press rarely tells because it is slow and it does not sell, is that the most reliable path to real, durable wealth is the one Earl Crawley walked and taught. Patient, boring, consistent, unglamorous, decade after decade after decade. Effective. If there is a North Star in this channel, a single thesis we will return to in every story, in every case study, it is this: ordinary people doing ordinary things with extraordinary patience build slow fortunes. More of them are out there, right now, in modest homes and uniforms, than the world will ever notice. And the country, at its best, is shaped quietly by their hands, and when they are as generous as Earl Crawley, by the hands they reach out to lift. If you want more stories like this one, stories of ordinary, underestimated people who built extraordinary things, subscribe. There is no shortage of them. We are only getting started.